author of Flâneurs, Women Walk the City, which was a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week. Her next book, 9192, A Diary of a Year on the Bus, will be out this September, as will her translation of Simone de Beauvoir's lost novel, The Inseparables. Lauren will be in conversation with Kristin, who is the New York Times bestselling author of The Winemaker's Wife, The Room on Rue Amélie, The Sweetness of Forgetting, as well as a dozen other novels that have been translated into 28 languages. And I want to know what is the most niche language. Kristin's new book, The Forest of Vanishing Stars, is out this July. Kristin and Lauren, thank you so much for being with us this evening at the library. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Alice. It's so nice to be here.
Thank you, Alice. This is amazing. We're very, very happy to be able to do this.
We are. So, Lauren, do you think we should begin by telling them our connection to the American Library in Paris?
Yeah, I think we should. I think it would enhance the evening's entertainments, or daytime's entertainments, as the case may be.
That is true. It is actually almost unbelievable. But why don't you start? Because without you, there would be no Paris connection for me. So I owe it all to you.
Okay. Well, so the year is 2002, springtime. I have been working at a literary agency in New York City, where I'm from, and a few years prior to that, 2 years prior to that, 3 years, I had studied abroad in Paris and fell in love with it, and was basically plotting a way to move back to France and never leave. And yeah, so I just decided to quit my job and go to Paris, and I found an apartment through the guy who did the housing for the Columbia University Paris program, which is what I had studied abroad on when I was a student. And I was like, hey, I'm coming to town and I need a place to live. Do you happen to have anything? And he had a 2-bedroom apartment in the 7th that was right upstairs from the American Library in Paris. And I was meant to be going with my friend Pam, who I had studied abroad with and who also loved Paris and wanted to return. But at the last minute, she was like, this is crazy. What am I going to do in Paris? Like, I need to get on with my life and have a career and, not like just swan around the streets of some European city. And I was like, okay, I already signed the lease. So I went right to mediabistro.com, which I don't know if any of you know it or remember it, but it was, I don't think it's still in operation. Maybe it is. It was a website for journalists, like really, really early, like in the website age, where there was just information about like, I don't know, like there's a job board and there were forums for, journalists to find each other, network and whatever. And so I posted an ad on Media Bistro saying, I'm going to live in Paris. Does anyone want to come live in Paris with me? Kristin, over to you.
So I was writing for People magazine at the time. I had been doing that for a couple of years, but I was a freelancer with People, and we were limited to 35 hours a week. But I was using my 35 hours a week bizarrely, because some weeks I was working 70 hours a week, and I just kind of had an under the table understanding with with my boss that I would just file the 35 and we would keep track of how much he owed me. And so he told me in April, I think it was, whenever it was that you posted, Lauren, I can't remember if it was April or May. I think it was April, but it was the day that you posted. I think he told me your hours have run out for the year and your year doesn't start again until August, but you'll be paid all summer because you've accrued all these hours. So I thought, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do. I had been to France once on a family vacation. I had minored in Spanish in college. I spoke no French, as you can attest to, Lauren, from the fact that I followed you around Paris all summer. Please translate for me. I tried to learn. I'm just not great at languages. But yeah, so I saw your listing. I think it was $600 a month, fully furnished, all utilities included, overlooking the Eiffel Tower. You were my age. You were another writer like me. And it was the exact amount of time I needed to keep myself occupied. So it was the most impulsive, strange thing I've ever done. And I still remember climbing, I think it was 5 flights of stairs to the apartment and knocking on the door and thinking, I actually don't know if it's going to be a 20-something girl named Lauren on the other side, or if it's going to be, or if I've just like walked into some horror film. I don't even know. But luckily it was you, and it was a great apartment. And that became the summer that changed my life. I don't know about you, but The friendship that we formed, but also just I feel like I discovered who I was meant to be as a person and as a writer that summer in Paris, and I think it's one of the reasons that that I keep returning to Paris in my work, returning to France in my work. Because I kind of I feel like I find myself there every time, and I know for you, I've just basically returned to Paris for visits and increasingly in my own imagination. But you have continued to live on and off in Paris for the last 20 years. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Your story with Paris?
Yeah, well, so I finally made it back in 2004 for good, for good, we say for good.
Yeah.
And now, now I'm coming to you from Liverpool. So for good, we see how these things go. But yeah, I moved there for good in 2004. And yeah, I don't know. I arranged my life so that I could live in France. I did a PhD so that I could be an academic. I figured, being a professor of English literature was something I could do anywhere. So I signed up for a PhD in France. So I have a French doctorate and taught there for many years, started writing professionally, I don't know, here and there. It's a really boring story how one comes to be a writer. And yeah, and then published this book about walking in Paris and how important walking was. Oh, you're so cute. Thank you.
No, wait, look, I also
God.
have, look what else I have.
Oh my God, oh no, oh no, oh no.
No, so
okay.
Lauren, you're incredible. And I just think you've just had the courage to build the life you wanted, which I think is so cool. And yeah, it's great. And I'm so glad we're still connected. I'm so glad. I mean, you're still one of my dearest friends. You gave the toast at my wedding. You helped my husband propose to me. Like we're, and that has to do with the American Library in Paris too, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that later.
Yeah, we've got to
we've got to talk about the book.
Tantalizing for later. But I want to talk about your book because that's what we're here to celebrate, is the paperback publication of the Book of Lost Names.
Yeah.
But I finished it today and I was shattered, like on my sofa, just like not able to cope with life for a little while. It was just it's like the perfect ending. I don't want to give away what the ending is, obviously, but it's just, I'm so impressed with the breadth of research and the way that you wield the research, because research is a really tricky thing to do in historical fiction. In contemporary fiction, it doesn't matter what period you're writing about, how to handle the research in a way that isn't like, I looked this up in a book, want to know what I found out, here's a character who's going to share it with you, so I guess my first question that I'd love to hear you talk about is how you came to write this book, and built into it is how do you approach research in your work, and how do you pull it off with such like lightness of touch, Well, it's not heavy-handed, it's not in your face.
Lauren, I have so much respect for you as a writer, and as a literature critic, that I almost hesitated to ask if you wanted to do this event with me today, because I was like, I know, she's probably not going to think my writing's that good, and
oh my God,
I don't know if she's really read me, because you're like all fancy, and anyways. No, I really appreciate the kind words. Thank you. That is so kind of you, and I felt similarly strongly about your books, which we'll talk about also, but. As far as the Book of Lost Names, it's the story of a female forger in World War II, just for any of you who haven't read it yet, who stumbles into the French resistance, mostly by accident, and winds up helping save the lives of hundreds of children. So that's kind of the premise. And so one of the things I really had to dive into first with this research was to get my head around how forgery would have been done during World War II. And not just that, but how you would have gotten into forgery. I mean, it's not like there was a job listing in the newspaper and you just answered it and said, yes, I'd like to be a forger. These were people who, to a large extent, stumbled into it because of their own need to forge documents. So as Ava does in the book, Ava winds up having to forge documents for her mother and herself on the fly to get out of Paris because they're on a list for arrest and deportation. And in doing so, she discovers sort of this hidden talent for it. And then she has to face the question of, okay, we've gotten out of Paris. We could just kind of shelter now and assume we're going to be safe, or I could do something with this talent to help other people. So it was really interesting finding out the real stories of people who found their way into forgery, and then how that job would develop. So The research usually takes me the first few months before I put pen to paper or finger to keyboard, as the case may be, and actually begin writing. I do a lot of background research, and it's that research that kind of shapes the story and shapes the direction that the plot will take, because I find out things along the way and I think, okay, like that makes more sense then if the main character does such and such, or so on and so forth. But the research for this book, one of the things that kind of tripped me up a little bit was, in a lot of the reading I did, there were a lot of mentions of different types of paper, and how if you didn't have exactly the right type of paper, it would be an easier forgery to spot, and how later in the war, uh, the Allies, for example, were dropping blank papers into France because the papers themselves were that important. So one of the things that helped me to understand that was to actually get my hands on a Nazi-issued travel document that was issued in Paris in 1940. So this was stamped the 2nd of December 1940, and this is a travel permit that you would have used to travel around the country. Um, and it was something that forgers would have very commonly forged, because you couldn't get anywhere without one of these. So this was something really essential. So this was fascinating because having it in my hands made it easier for me to wrap my head around the differences between the different kinds of paper, and how a seal would have been done and how a stamp would have been done. And some of it almost allowed me to take the things I was reading about and physically put my hands on it and say, I get it. And then hopefully explain that to you the same way. And the other kind of cool research thing, just because I like to do my little show and tell, is this is the real life Book of Lost Names. So the Book of Lost Names is fictional. The code within the Book of Lost Names, which is a code inside of the novel, is fictional. But this is the real life 1732 Catholic religious text that I used as a model for the one in the book. So this was kind of important too, because I think one of the morals of this story, or not morals, but one of the themes of this story, is this idea that books carry with them so much more than the stories between their pages. You know what I mean? So this book from 1732 has passed through so many people's hands and took a journey from France to the United States, for example. I mean, think of how many stories, how many lives came in contact with that book. And I loved that idea too. So that was a book I put my hand physically on every day of the writing, to remind myself of our connection to the past and our connection to stories, and ultimately our connection to libraries. I mean, if you think about it, libraries are places where a single book could be shared by 20, 30, 40 people over the course of time, and they could all take something different from it and all be touched and shaped by it in a different way. So yeah, books matter.
They do. I love that.
So, Lauren, I know we're talking about the Book of Lost Names, but I do want you to talk a little bit about, just because it's also has an awesome Paris element. Can you talk a little bit about Flanus, since it's the book you have out now?
Yeah, it's funny, while you were talking, I was thinking about a section in the introduction, I think, where I talk about why it was important to me to move to Paris, specifically from the suburbs of Long Island, where I grew up, and what it meant to me to be able to be in a place where so many people had been, not just since, the founding of my town on Long Island, but, for thousands of years before that, back to the Romans, and what that does to a place, how it charges a place, the atmosphere of a place.
Completely.
And how you're always on the lookout for ghosts you know about, ghosts you don't know about, ghosts you could imagine, ghosts you can't imagine. And how many books have been written about those places, because obviously I love books too. And so just something about Paris, more than any other city, just brought like history and literature to life. It was like I was walking in it, and
it's magical there. Absolutely. Yeah.
So there's something about walking in the city that for me is like being in a massive library. You're just surrounded by all these stories. If you care to investigate, beyond just walking from point A to point B, sort of look around you, see, and this goes for the suburbs as well. I don't mean to slam the suburbs, like people have lived there. Certainly, where I'm from on Long Island, we are not on virgin territory that's only been occupied since, the Dutch and the British got there. There have been people there for a very long time. So that's something that I'm sort of writing about now have been writing about for a while, and hope to include in a future essay collection, is this concept of space having a history, and how just because you can't see an old building doesn't mean that the space hasn't been lived in and inhabited by people, and anyway. But yeah, so Flâneuse is really an attempt to get to grips with how transformative and important, both personally and politically, it is to walk in the city. And so every chapter is about a different city that I've lived and walked in, but most of the chapters are about Paris because I did most of my living and walking in Paris in my adult life. There's also a bit about London, where I spend a lot of time, and Venice, and Tokyo. And then there's a bit about Martha Gellhorn in Spain, even though I've never lived in Spain, just because, I don't know, I was being cheeky. So so yeah, but I would love to bring it back to Paris again, and your time in Paris when you were there with me that summer in 2002. Yeah. What kind of writing were you doing back then? How was that time forming you as a writer? Were you doing any walking that you remember?
I remember walking a lot, and it's funny because I get asked a lot, because I write so often about France, what are your favorite things to do when you go to Paris, or can you give me some recommendations? My biggest recommendation is always walk. I walk. I mean, it's just a walk and then drink some wine, basically, and maybe eat some pastries and some bread, but mostly
and then walk it off.
And walk it off, exactly. No, I just remember spending so much of that summer walking, and one of the things that influenced me about that is exactly what you said, that idea of being surrounded by ghosts, by being surrounded by history, and sort of the power in that. But it was also the idea, and I think it's a more culturally French thing than it is a culturally American thing, that idea of slowing down and having the time for a walk and to look up and to see the world around you. Because, at that time, right before you and I met, Lauren, I was so much on that magazine fast track. I was working 60, 70 hours a week. I was driving myself crazy. And I didn't have my eye on anything other than working as hard as I could, to meet the next deadline and to, start moving up the magazine ladder. And that's not really what I wanted out of my life. So that summer in Paris was very transformative for me. And part of it was walking. And I do remember writing in Paris. I was working on my first book in Paris, which was very different. Lauren, you're going to laugh because I bet you'll remember this. It was before laptops were small enough and had long enough battery lives to take them anywhere with you, because it was almost 20 years ago. And I mean, I'm sure I could have hauled my laptop with me, but I had this little tiny word processor. Do you remember it? It was blue and it was kind of clear, and it was just this word processor, and I would go sit in various parks throughout Paris and just write. It was the dreamiest thing, and it would have probably been dreamier if I could have written in long-handed notebooks, but I would never have been able to decipher my own handwriting later. So a funky old word processor it was. But I was writing much lighter stuff then. I was writing chick lit, kind of romantic comedies. And in retrospect, it was because I didn't think I had the depth yet to write anything different than that. I thought that that's where I was in my life, because I was in my early 20s, and I thought, well, what do I know? I know dating. I know, what it's like to be in your 20s. I know what it's like to be fresh and young in a job. And I wish I had allowed myself to go deeper. But that was the beginning of it. It's where I really taught myself to read or to read critically and shape myself as a writer through that, and through sort of the observations of the world around me. How about you?
I don't know. It's so interesting to talk to you about this so many years later, because, obviously at the time we were talking a lot about this stuff and wanting to become writers and how, what kind of work we wanted to do. And subsequently, from time to time we've revisited it, but to be just turned 42 and about to turn 42, exactly. Mothers, looking back to that time in our lives, it just feels so incredibly distant. I mean, I didn't know anything about anything. I am not from a town where people write books. I'm not from a place where people move to foreign countries. I remember one of my professors at Barnard, where I went to undergrad, which that was the experience that changed my life. I mean, I had never heard of Simone de Beauvoir until, one of the other girls name dropped her, and I was like, who's that? What's the second sex? But I remember I had a teacher there And I told her, I want to be a writer, and I think maybe I want to be a professor. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do I do? And she was like, read everything, like everything, absolutely everything. And, you know, she said this in like 2000, 2001, you know, now you can't read everything. And my advice would not be that to people who want to start as writers. I think
read a lot though. Yeah.
Read a lot. I mean, stay off of Twitter unless you have to for work. Don't read that crap. Oh my God, like it'll waste your time and rot your brain and make you think you have to do this performative thing that's awful and not good for your writing. But yeah, that summer in Paris, I was reading everything. I was trying to read as much as I could. And I think I didn't have the self-belief to think that I could write the kind of books that I write now.
Yep.
I wanted to be an academic and was focusing on, you know, I was going back to New York in the fall and starting a PhD program there. And yeah, it was a summer of giving myself permission to just like see where things could go and learning as much as I could about the world and since that day at Barnard when someone told me about Simone de Beauvoir, I feel like I've been trying to catch up and like read all the stuff that I didn't know about, you know, or that I knew about so late. I mean, I was 19, but I felt like I was so late.
It's just incredible to look back at that time and think how far we've come. I mean, I can't believe it's been almost 20 years, especially since clearly we're not a day over 25.
I know, exactly. Look at this skin. I mean, thank you, Zoom filter.
I know what's going to happen when we have to go out in the world again and people can actually see my wrinkles. It's just
I know.
bad. Yeah, exactly.
I know.
So yeah, I see people asking a little bit more about the Book of Lost Names. And I know we promised we would talk about it. So let me just talk a little bit more about, I'm just trying to think what I said already. Okay. So as I said, it's about a female forger. So what happens in the book is, for those of you who haven't read it, and by the way, also, if anyone's listening from the UK, it comes out tomorrow in the UK. So Lauren, you can go buy a physical copy tomorrow. It just came out in Ireland too. And it'll be out in paperback in May, the end of May here in the States. But so anyhow, the forger I mentioned at the beginning, Ava, she and her mother are fleeing the Nazis, and they wind up in this small French mountain town in the unoccupied zone, where a priest who's working for a local resistance network finds out about the false papers that she's forged, approaches her and offers her help in getting her father out of a detention center outside of Paris where he's being held. So she reluctantly agrees, and kind of the thing that she has to do in exchange is start helping him with some forged documents. And she thinks it's going to be temporary. She thinks, okay, you know, I'll do this so I can get my father out and then we'll be on our way. But she discovers a real passion for it. She meets Remy, who's another forger, and together they begin forging these documents, primarily for children. But then she starts to worry about the fate of these children she's sending on under assumed names elsewhere. And so they decide to start encoding those names in a book they call the Book of Lost Names, which, like I showed you, is very similar to this particular 1732 religious text, which was, you know, what I used in the research. So anyhow, they also include messages to each other within the Book of Lost Names. And at the end of the war, or toward the end of the war, the resistance cell is blown, the book goes missing, and with it kind of go the final secrets that Remy left for her. And so then we pick up with her again 60 years later. She's a librarian working in Florida, and she happens to glimpse the book in an article in the New York Times about Nazi looted books and the search to return them to their rightful owners. So as we see this story unfolding in the past, we also see it unfolding in 2005 as she has to make the decision to travel to Berlin to finally uncover the last secret possibly held within the pages of the Book of Lost Names. And I just saw a question in the comments there asking me to show the pages. So I don't know if you can see it because I've got my light on, but yeah, it is this old book printed in 1732, and like the inside cover. I'm always so afraid it's going to disintegrate in my hands, but you know, you can see that's the beautiful inside cover. I know. And actually, you know what's cool? Just talking about this book. Look how similar it looks to the book on the cover of the US edition. I think there used to be gilding on the cover. It's just worn off over the years. And look at the two spines side by side.
Oh, that's amazing.
The cover designer never saw the book. She had no idea I had the book. That was just,
oh my God, that's amazing.
So yeah, just one of those things that feels like it was kind of meant to be. So that's kind of the idea of the book, and it's been a crazy year with this book. It's been, oh, someone's asking where I got the 1732 book. eBay. It's not a very interesting answer from a reputable used books dealer on eBay. So
where did you get the Nazi Aufweis?
Also eBay from a
Okay.
reputable
Wow.
French document dealer on eBay.
Wow.
I just, if I hadn't said this already on so many Zooms about this book, I really should have considered making up something much more romantic. Like I was strolling by the Seine and the breeze brought it to me, or, you know.
This book just came floating towards me. Paris is so magical.
Just knocked me in the head, and I was like, I should probably write about this book. Yeah. No, but eBay, very exciting. But yeah, those are really helpful things to have. And it's been a really interesting year with this book. It's been so well received here, which I've just been so grateful for. But I think one of the reasons is people look back at World War II and find a lot of lessons that are still really applicable to today, and particularly to this whole last year. I mean, you know, there's not really, there's no comparison when you think of what people went through in World War II and what we're going through today with the pandemic. But there are echoes of it. I mean, that feeling of you have to make sacrifices. We all have to band together. The world is changing around us. We have no control over the way the world is changing around us. And there's fear. There's fear of the unknown, and there's fear of, you know, maybe not so much now as there was toward the beginning of the pandemic, but fear of survival, fear of whether our loved ones will survive, that feeling of disconnectedness from the world. And so one of the messages that I feel like this book has is that idea that we all have it within us to rise up and be extraordinary in the tough times. And I think that applies to now too. And also that idea that you don't have to wait for someone else to light the light for you in the darkness. You can light the light yourself. You can be the light. You know what I mean? And so I feel like that's been something that I maybe has resonated during the pandemic. I hope. Because I feel like I'm a broken record on that topic also, because I feel like that's unwittingly been or unconsciously been sort of the theme of my last 3 books. So
it's very hopeful. I like the optimistic, glass half full kind of take on it. I have like PTSD from being in so many cities that had terrorist attacks happening in them. So I'm much more on the, bad shit can happen to you in your world, in your life.
Yeah.
side.
Well, you know, but I mean, even if you think about that, like think about, I mean, think about what that must have felt like to live through World War II when it was the essentially terrorist attacks. If you lived in Paris, right? Terrorist attacks happening to you all the time, with no one to turn to for help, and no one really to come to your rescue, because that was government sponsored at that time, really.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, especially if you're Jewish. Absolutely. So it's terrifying though to kind of think of the past echoing in the present in that way. Let me see what else I have for you. Yeah, sorry.
I wanted to ask, because this is something that I was thinking about. I mean, I'm thinking about it a lot generally in the book I'm writing right now, which is a little bit about motherhood and creativity. Something that I have found in my own life since I gave birth to my son a couple of years ago, is I'm a lot more sensitive. I'm like very touchy. So I take very badly stories, you know, in the newspaper about something bad happening, not just to a child, but like to anyone, anywhere. It's like I'm missing a layer of skin. Like I sort of can't cope. So you can imagine the last year I've basically just been on the floor. Not that everyone else hasn't, but you know, as a new mother, it's like, these were people, they were children once, you know?
No, totally.
So, and it's a problem as a writer, because and as a literary critic, you know, to boot, you have to be able to like stare down the hard truths about this world and go in search of, you know, difficult emotions, and just, you know, face down the very worst that can happen to you. And so, and you've done this in this book that you have most certainly written, you know, in the 5 years since your son was born. So I wonder what it's like for you as a mother who is very touchy, to face down the Holocaust, and how do you do it?
Well, that's a great question. And I will begin by saying, yes, I feel like my emotions are very close to the surface too. And today would be a perfect example. I took Noah blueberry picking this morning, and I was just thinking about how I miss my mom, which is so weird. Like she lives 20 minutes from me, but we don't really ever see her because we're both just being super safe with the pandemic. And I started crying in the blueberry field. And Noah said, "Why are you crying when there's nothing sad to cry about?" And I was like, "I don't know. Like, I don't know." So yes, the emotions are very close to the surface. You're totally right. That's not a normal thing for me. I don't know why that hit me like that today, but luckily I was outside and had sunglasses, so nobody but Noah was any the wiser.
Yeah, exactly.
But as for how I tackle tough things like that, I don't know. I think that's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for it. I feel like we have to. I feel like as writers, if you're writing a kind of book that asks the reader to go on a journey with you and to dive deep and to hopefully have their heart or their soul changed a tiny bit in the process, you owe it to them to put yourself in that really emotionally vulnerable spot. Because if you don't go there, the book can't go there. And, you know, I feel like with the Book of Lost Names, there was not a lot of that on the surface. Excuse me. There was not a lot of that on the surface of the story. We don't see a lot of horrible things happening on the page, but we know of the horrible things that are happening behind the scenes. We know what's happened to Ava's father. We know the risks that she faces if she's caught. We know what happens to these children if they can't get out of France. And I think that I've written so many books now set in that time period with those circumstances that it's almost like a thing that I constantly live with and that keeps oozing out of my pores onto the page, because it's such an important thing to keep talking about. Because if we don't keep talking about it, and I don't mind, I don't mean that you have to be reminded of the horror and violence at every turn, but I think you have to be reminded of how it feels to read those things that happened to real people just like me and you, and just like any of us, and how we're really only just a step away from that happening again, or how it does repeatedly happen in different parts of the world. So I feel like, I don't know, I feel like as a writer, you have to face those uncomfortable truths. I will tell you that my next book, The Forest of Vanishing Stars, the one that comes out this summer, in the beginning of July in the States, goes darker and goes deeper. And that was a harder book for me to write because I did have to put more of that onto the page. And putting it onto the page required me to put it onto the page in a way that was researched and hopefully nuanced and very realistic. And it was hard because it did require me to go to a dark place. And I don't know. How about you? How do you balance writing stuff that's emotional or that requires you to dig deep with then resuming the rest of your life in a happy way with your almost 3-year-olds?
I think I've mostly been avoiding doing it since he was born. I mean, my book is structured in, it was 3 parts, now I don't know, but definitely the last part of it is about motherhood and writing. And I've been putting it off, and the book is due in like June for July, let's say.
Oh gosh.
July 1st, which is really July 15th, which while you're at it, I mean, end of the summer. So anyway, I do need to write this part of the book.
What is time?
Really, it's just a big loop, right? So I already handed in my book, it already came out, everybody loved it.
There's been a movie made, you've accepted your Oscar. I got you.
Oh my God, the Oscars was amazing. My dress is so cool.
Congratulations on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So yeah, I think, I'm really putting it off, and I'm going to have to write about it. That's the thing about writing nonfiction, is you can kind of grapple with these things in real time on the page. You can kind of be, very meta and invite the reader in, and like, especially since like Jeff Dyer wrote a book about failing to write a book about D.H. Lawrence, that's a move that you can make. So, I'm going to try to like face up to that as part of the writing, I think, and as a way to mediate it. But yeah, I've been writing a novel since 2007, that my publisher in the UK bought on a partial manuscript. So like it is, one day going to actually be a book. But I keep I keep putting it off because there's a miscarriage early on. And I just don't want to go there again, having, lived through it. I know I have to go there. I know I need to face it down. And I think we don't talk about miscarriage enough at all, really, at all.
Yeah.
So it's important that we have, writers tell the stories, or journalists, dig down and share their stories. It feels, as you say, politically kind of necessary to tell these stories. But yeah, I'm definitely putting it off.
Well, hey, I understand that, and it's a good point about facing up to things. It's interesting. I feel like every novel I write starts off as me wanting to tell a story, and winds up with me discovering something new about myself, because they require you to go to those deep places and those sometimes dark places. And writing a book requires you to ask yourself questions that are difficult questions so that you know how to answer them on the page. And I didn't realize that back at the beginning when I was writing chick lit titled How to Sleep with a Movie Star. That didn't really require me to go to any dark places.
God, what a journey, seriously.
Isn't that weird? Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
That's where I started. Not a real how-to guide, all of you, for the record. Don't pick it up expecting any tips. You will get it. The books I write now do require me to go to those dark places, and I feel such a depth of transformation that has taken place over the last 10 years for me. And so that's something that I take away from the page, but it's something that I hope is reflected on the page too. And that maybe if you read my books, maybe you get to go on a tiny piece of that journey with me, I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find recurrent across books about the Holocaust, or more the Holocaust than the Second World War, your book kind of straddles, both, is that they're so often, when they're published by people, say, born 1960 and after, they're so often mediated somehow. There's either like a frame narrative, as there is in your book, or it's like a search for someone who knew someone, or a search for the story. It's always like, it's never just kind of the story directly told. And even sometimes when it's directly told, it can feel a bit like, I don't know, almost manipulative, when it's done badly, which is not at all how books are. But you do the frame narrative thing.
Did you bring me here today, Lauren, to tell me I wrote my book wrong? I did.
Yeah, I did. I'm sorry. I've been waiting.
This is really just an intervention with like 80 of our closest friends.
Now that I have won an Oscar, I feel like I can tell you.
Yeah, you could talk down to me because of your future Oscar.
Exactly. But I just wonder. The Holocaust is obviously this momentous event that prompts philosophers to say, there can be no poetry after Auschwitz. How do you write after Auschwitz? And I think for that generation, it was very difficult, obviously, to write about. But for people of our generation, it's like, how do you write about, how do you make poetry after Auschwitz? You do it with a frame narrative.
Yeah.
You put some distance there. But so I wonder how like the ethics of writing about something like that come into play when you're thinking about
that's a really good question, and I also think maybe it's one of the reasons I haven't actually written about any I'm just going through my head to make sure I haven't. I don't think I've ever set a scene in a concentration camp before, because that's something I don't know that I feel confident in my ability to do justice to. And I'm not ruling it out for the future. I mean, if the story takes me to that place in the future, I would think hard about it. But I don't feel prepared as a human being to do that yet. I think some people are. I think some people aren't. And I really try to honor the past by not telling stories I don't feel qualified or prepared to tell. So a big part of it is, I think, just doing the adequate research, but also, speaking to people who lived through things like that. And so much of it, I think, is really trying to connect deeply to the emotion and psychology of it also, because that's at the heart of that whole story, of anybody who survived and of anybody who perished. And one of the things I think that fascinates me most, which might be why I tend to tell these stories with a present day framework, which interestingly, the Forest of Vanishing Stars, the one that comes out July 6th, is not told with the framework. So it was almost like I took the training wheels off, and I felt ready to do it. And there was not even a thought in my head that it needed to have a present day framework. It doesn't. It just takes place in the past, because that was the right decision for that story. But one of the things that fascinates me most, which I think is why I like to see where we are with our characters in 60 or 75 years or whatever, and why I like to go back and forth is the psychological impact of what happened to them then, and how that echoes through the generations.
Yeah.
And that echo through the generations is something that I think will probably shape my writing through at least the next decade of my career, because I'm sort of in the process of exploring my own past. And it's funny, Lauren, I realized before we came on today that I don't think you and I have had a conversation about this, but you know, when we lived together in Paris, well, you're Jewish and I'm Catholic. But my dad's whole side of the family is Jewish, and that was not something I had ever really explored or identified with, because I don't know if you remember, but you know, I was a little bit distant from my dad. We're much closer now, but I didn't really grow up with that. And it turns out that my dad's family came from my dad's Jewish side of the family, my Jewish side of the family, my dad's side comes from France and comes from Poland. And those are now the two areas I have found myself drawn to consistently again and again writing about. And I don't think I've necessarily done that on purpose, but in exploring and trying to honor the past and the psychological impact of the past, and then just like the impact of the past in our own DNA, you know, I feel like this has been a very personal deep dive and exploration for me, because it's a piece of who I am, and I'm trying to do my best to honor that. So that was, I think I got off topic from your original question.
No, that's fascinating. It's really interesting. When did his family come over to the States, or were they there then? I guess is my question.
So no, they were not there in World War II. And I'm just looking at the clock. We should probably invite Alice back in for Q&A and in just a second. But just to quickly answer that question, I don't know if I've ever told you this, Lauren. My dad's grandmother was a World War I war bride. She was French. She lived within probably 10 minutes walking distance of our apartment of the American Library.
No way. Oh my God.
And I think she left Paris in 1920 with her New York born new American Jewish husband. And so they were in the States from about 1920. And on my dad's paternal side, they came from Poland, the area I'm writing about in The Forest of Vanishing Stars, about 50 years before World War II. But I just have been doing my Ancestry.com background, and it turns out that I could see in the records my maternal or my paternal great, I think she would have been my great-great-grandmother, Rosie Harmel, whose documents all say that she speaks only Yiddish. Traveling back to Europe in the 1930s, I presumably to visit her family, but it must have just been, I think it was 1933 or 1935. But there's evidence of her coming and going through New York, going back to
wow.
So just to think that she must have visited these loved ones and then gone home and seen what happened to
oh my God, you have to come back to Paris and go see where she lived and write about her.
Isn't that incredible? I know.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah. So Alice, you want to come back and join us?
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you both. Thank you, Lauren. And I always hate to kind of impose on what's become such a lovely conversation, but we have so many comments and questions, more than I've certainly ever received. This is kind of constant just commentary about, we love your books. This is my favorite book of 2020. I couldn't get off from the sofa for a week. My mascara was running.
Which actually, that's funny. Mine's running now. My eyes are like tearing up. I don't know what's wrong with me. The curse of the blueberry fields.
Yeah, exactly. If you've just joined us, welcome to Evenings with an Author. We're at the virtual American Library in Paris, and you've just listened to a wonderful and beautiful conversation between Lauren and Kristin, who are old friends, it turns out. So we did actually have a question, Kristin, about how do you kind of come up with the origins of your characters? So for instance, for Eva or Ava, I'm not sure, how would you come up with kind of her origins, for instance?
That's a great question. And I'm afraid I don't have the best answer. I think a lot of it comes from the research. So I generally have basic story idea, like that I could condense into a few sentences before I sit down to do the research. And then I begin diving into the research. And I think it's as I do the research and I begin to put in place the framework or like the skeleton of the story I want to tell, that the main character kind of just begins to develop as a natural outgrowth from that, if that makes sense. Because I feel like once you know what the story is going to be, you have a sense of what kind of main character with what kind of life situation and life challenges you need to put in motion on the page to make that story work. So it's all, and I feel like getting to know the character is a really important part of that process, but I tend to really develop the character as I'm doing the outline, because as I begin to understand more and more about where the story goes, I begin to understand more and more about who the character is, to the point that when I start an outline, it's very sparse at the beginning. And by the end, I'm writing like 2,000 words to describe a chapter that's only going to be 3,000 words, because I'm hearing the dialogue in my head. And I'm thinking of like, oh, and this character would reach for this, like I can see her doing things in my head. So I think it just evolves very naturally over the course of the plotting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we just had a question from Barbara, and this echoes a question that I had for you too, because you mentioned that when you tell a story, you feel that you discover something new about yourself. And so Barbara wants to know, what did you learn about yourself while writing this book?
Oh, see, you would think I would have a good answer for that question, since I've just now said I learned something about myself every book. I think one of the things I took away from writing this book was that it's okay to believe in yourself and your ability to affect change. And I think, Lauren, as someone who's known me for almost 20 years now, can probably speak to the fact that, when she knew me almost 20 years ago, I was very timid and shy and didn't really have a lot of self-confidence, and, was always worried about things. And I think that maybe the journey for me over the last few years of writing these books is writing women who don't start off strong, but who become strong because life hands them the opportunity to do that if they turn in the right direction. And I think I've realized now that life hands you those kinds of opportunities all the time, and you have to make a decision about whether you're going to face them and accept those opportunities, or whether you're going to continue on the same path. And so maybe that's what I've learned, that it's okay to face the scary things head on, and it's okay to say, this is me, I'm not perfect, but I'm doing my best.
Do you have an example of that in your own life?
Let's see, not crying in blueberry fields in the morning. I still don't know what came over me this morning.
I think crying in blueberry fields should be the title of your next book.
Exactly. I don't know if I do have an example. No, you know what? This isn't I don't know if this is a good example, but Lauren and I talked a little bit earlier about motherhood, and just it's tough to be a mother, and so it's especially tough to be a mother in a pandemic, because you doubt every decision you make, because there's no right decision. There's no right thing when it comes to whether you decide to send your child to school or not send your child to school. There's no right thing about whether you feel safe going to the playground or not. There are so many things, and there's truly no right and no wrong. And I think perhaps partially as a result of writing a book that taught me some things about self-confidence and grit, I think I still questioned a lot of my decisions, but I was able to make what I felt were the right decisions in my life for my child, and then to just say, it's okay if I'm not right, because I'm doing my best. You know what I mean? And it's also, it's okay not to be right. And so I don't know, maybe that's one example, aside from crying in blueberry fields, about personal growth.
Actually, and that kind of resonates really nicely with the question we had from Claire, who wonders on a kind of practical level, Kristin, how do you manage to write and deal with a toddler? And maybe Lauren, you can chime in.
Yeah, I would love to hear Lauren's answer to this too. So with me, it's been, so Noah just turned 5 a couple months ago. So I think it's both simpler and more complicated in different areas. So he doesn't, he's a little bit more self-sufficient, but 5 isn't particularly self-sufficient. You can't just say, here's the keys to the car, go out and entertain yourself. I mean, you could, but that would probably not be well received by the authorities. or would be considered responsible parenting in any way. But my whole schedule has changed. I used to write when he was in school, and now I write every morning from 6 to 8:30. But unfortunately, the majority of that time is responding to messages or, doing the business side of writing, which means I spend a lot more time away from the page than I would like, which has been difficult, and which means I'm really behind schedule on the book I'm writing for next year. But I also write on weekends. My husband takes Noah until 2 o'clock on weekends. So I work from 6 until 2 on weekends. But I've done over 100 virtual events since my book came out last summer. Over 150, or gosh, over 180 actually, if you count all the Friends and Fiction events I've done, because we've done 64 episodes of that now, and a lot of them are during the day like this. So it's 2:20 in the afternoon here in the States, on the East Coast of the States, and Noah is in the other room watching Lion Guard. So I'm really not being a particularly great mother. But he's also become a Lego master this year, because that's one of the ways that I feel like he can be constructively entertained while I'm doing something. He's 5, and he now entirely by himself, can build 18 and up, like age 18 and up Lego sets, which should give you an idea of how much I've entertained him with Legos over the last year. So sorry. I'm doing my best. How about you, Lauren? How have you dealt with that with the 2.5-year-old?
Yeah, well, during lockdown last year, we had him, at home together, and my partner is a composer. So we both do this creative work that before we had a child took up all our time. When you're a writer, like there's no weekends, there's no work after work, like it's just work all the time. Service of your vision. And for the lockdown, it was like, oh, hi, small person. I guess we have to figure out what to do, So I have a wonderfully supportive partner. You shouldn't even have to say my partner is supportive. It should just be this way. But anyway, we split it 50-50. Neither one of us took precedence over the other. And now he's back in school, thankfully. So, it's not like so difficult. I'm still super envious of my friends who don't have kids, or who decided not to have kids, because they just have all this time. What did I even do with myself? Like, I just don't remember. But yeah, my life has more structure now. It's, in the morning I take care of my baby, then I work all day, then he comes home from school, I take care of him again. And then right now, it's like, it's adult time.
Yeah.
We can talk about the Holocaust now. It's okay.
Exactly. The kids in bed. Legos are done. We can talk about the Holocaust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lovely. I think we have time for one more question, and this is from Barbara. And so Barbara wants to know, Kristin, how do you give yourself a certain amount of time for research, and how/when do you say enough is enough?
That is such a good question. That is the ultimate question.
It is a great question. So I would say I kind of do it in 3 phases. And it's largely dictated by when my book deadline is. And I'm kind of on a book a year right now. So I wish I had the luxury to just say, I'm going to research until I can't research anymore, but that would never work out, because I would never turn my book in. So I would say I generally do a couple months of reading. Just reading everything I can get my hands on about whatever topic I'm writing about. But I tend to do that as I'm finishing up edits on the previous book. So that's kind of the one overlap. I'm not really doing super creative work on the new book yet, but it's almost forming up here as I'm researching it. And kind of, as I said before, the framework of that story starts to develop. And then when I feel like I really have those facts in place, then I kind of start thinking, how can I supplement these facts with the feelings that go along with it, or with the tangible things that go along with it. So for The Forest of Vanishing Stars, the book that's coming out this summer, which is set in Eastern Poland during World War II. It's about Jewish refugees who survived in the forests of Eastern Poland by basically setting up societies there and spending a couple of years in the woods evading the Nazis. And they lived that way. And the most famous group who did that was the Bielski Otriad, the Bielski brothers, who, if you have not seen the 2008 film Defiance, starring Daniel Craig, you should watch it, and not just because it's about the Bielskis, but because it has Daniel Craig in it. And I'm just helping you out here. No, it's a phenomenal movie. It's based on the book Defiance, which is it's the true story of the Bielskis. So I had the great honor of being able to talk to the youngest Bielski brother, the only one who's still alive. He'll be 94 this summer. As fate would have it, he lives in Florida. How convenient for me, right?
That's
And
crazy.
it's amazing. And he had a lot to share about his memories of living in the woods that I think not only helped me bring the story to life a little bit more, but in my own head helped me connect what I had read. So like I kind of had all the facts at my fingertips and in my brain, but having someone talk about how those facts were applied in real life almost just brought it alive for me. And so that was really phenomenal. So I try to do something like that with every book that brings it alive, you know, before I delve too deeply into the writing. So then once I kind of feel like I have the research under my belt, I begin to outline. And I outline really thoroughly, but because I'm outlining, I'm researching as I go, because then I'm realizing, okay, I know all the stuff I need to get from point A to point B, but there's a gap between point B to point Z. So I need to specifically outline this, that, and this, you know, or I mean, research this, that, and this, right? So then I dive into that research. So my research becomes a little bit more refined along the way. And then as I begin to write, I don't do as much research while I'm writing because I've already done so much of it. But there are a lot of spots that I know I don't know something, and I don't slow down and try to figure it out unless it's an essential plot point. Like I don't slow down and think, what kind of mushroom would they have eaten in this location in the forest, because I could spend a week figuring out the mushroom and then I haven't written any words. So at that point I leave those details like that for the end, and I just mark them in the manuscript, find out the kind of mushroom, or I just put a TK in the manuscript, and then I come back and fill in all those blanks later. But if I hit a point where I need the research to move me forward, I do that, and then at the end I go through and I double check and triple check absolutely everything. I often hire an expert to do some of the research on the back end and make sure I've gotten everything correct, because I don't always trust myself. For this upcoming book, I hired a professor who is also a Nalibaki forest guide. So his expertise is like the flora and fauna of the Nalibaki forest, which was the stuff that I wasn't sure about. So that was super helpful. But yeah, and then there's never really a point where I feel like I'm info dumping, because I feel like the research shapes every beat of it. And I try to use the research as like the paint to color in the world as I go, if that makes sense. So it's the framework and then like the paint within the framework, and then hopefully pretty words along with it.
Oh,
So
lovely.
sorry, really long-winded answer.
Fantastic. Lauren and Kristin, thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation. You know, it's clear that you're all friends because it just flowed so naturally.
Oh, well, thanks. I wish we could have talked. Do we have one more minute for Lauren to tell us about her new book that's coming out, number 91?
Yes.
Oh
I
God.
totally, it's so, because it's Paris centered, so I really want to hear about it quickly.
Lauren, if you don't mind, while you do, I'm just going to launch this poll that I've created for the audience. So while you're listening to Lauren, just cast your eye or get ready to take this poll that I will launch. And okay.
Oh God, sorry. It's a weirdo book that I wrote entirely in the Notes app on my iPhone when I was commuting from my apartment in the 5th arrondissement of Paris to my teaching job at the American University of Paris in the 7th. So I went along the Boulevard Montparnasse and the Boulevard des Invalides, and I took the 91, changed at Montparnasse to the 92 and back. So it's just this. It's very short. It's like 12,000 words, and every page is an entry in the Notes app of like what's going on the bus that day, what the Parisians are up to, what I'm going through, what I'm teaching in my teaching job, just what I'm thinking about. So it's a weird kind of personal diary that over the course of this academic year, 2014, 2015, it ends up including the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January. It becomes a kind of exercise in registering the event with a capital E on an everyday level, and just looking at how people are reacting to what's happened and how it's made us all kind of feel as a community. But a lot of that's just acting, because I didn't actually interview anyone. It's not like journalism. And then towards the end of that school year, I had an ectopic pregnancy and had emergency surgery, and they removed a fallopian tube. So it also becomes about being pregnant on a bus, and then, oh God, no, I'm not pregnant anymore, and I wanted to be, and that sucks. So the personal event with the be every day becomes a sort of later part. So yeah, someone's asking what I teach at AUP. I was teaching literature, English and French literature. And in that particular semester or 2 semesters, I was teaching a class on writing the city. So I think that's why I was so interested in writing down what I saw happening around me. So there's a couple of essays bookending the book so that it feels more like a book, but most of it is just these observations about what people are wearing and what I think of what they're wearing.
And you also,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Alice. Sorry. No, please.
I was just saying, you also have a translation of de Beauvoir's Lost.
Yeah, The Inseparables. Yeah, so that's very exciting. That book is the novel that she wrote about her friendship with her childhood best friend Zaza, who tragically died when they were like 21. And she wrote it, and she tried to write about this friendship multiple times in her books. And this is the novel, or it's very short, it's more of a novella, where she tells this from beginning to end. And it's basically just it's like putting on trial France and the bourgeoisie and Catholicism, strict Catholicism at that time, and basically indicting them for killing her friend. And Sartre told her not to publish it. He was like, it doesn't work for me. It's like a little too personal. I think you should in a drawer.
Wow.
So, and then all these years later, her adoptive daughter found it in her papers and said, well, this is actually this. So it came in France this past year, and it's coming out in the UK in September. And then there's a different American translation coming out in America that I didn't do. So my translation will be out of the UK, and hopefully that's the one that you all will read. But you can also read the other one, or both of them. We're not competing. We're just trying to ring truth.
How exciting! How exciting! Well, listen, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to host you tonight at Evenings with an Author.